message to Democrats. This is how you do it. A corrupt leader with misogynistic and intolerant leanings resigned late last night, driven from office by an investigation in the legislature and protests from the people he represented. While many of us were still focused on the takeaways from the Mueller hearings, the people of Puerto Rico took to the streets late last night to celebrate. NBC News is reporting, quote, crowds in the street, which for almost 2 weeks have been calling for the governor to step down, immediately erupted in joyous chants, cheering Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico. The island, parts of which were decimated by Hurricane Maria, and which has been the target of political attacks from Donald Trump, investigated its governor's corruption and signaled an impeachment could be on the horizon. NBC News adds this, quote, the news came after 3 attorneys commissioned by the president of Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, Carlos Mendez Nunez, unanimously found 5 offenses that constituted grounds for impeachment. Of course, an investigation that uncovers offenses that constitute grounds for impeachment has undeniable parallels to calculations being made by Washington Democrats in the wake of high-profile investigations into Donald Trump.
If we have a case for impeachment, that's the place we will have to go. The fact that why I'd like it to be a strong case is because it's based on the facts in the law. That's what matters, not politics, not partisanship, just patriotism. The stronger our case is, the worse the Senate will look for just letting the president off the hook.
Our friend Rosie Perez joined us here earlier this week to talk about the stakes for the people of Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico is a mess, but the people of Puerto Rico are not a mess. The people of Puerto Rico are not corrupt. The government of Puerto Rico is corrupt. The government of Puerto Rico is a mess. And to put that on the entire island of people really makes me so angry. They want things fixed. They want justice. This is not even a socialist issue. I know that's the hot push button attack right now. It is not.
All of this, of course, brings us to ask some uncomfortable questions of the Democrats in Washington. Do you have the stomach for the political fight before you? My colleague Joe Scarborough weighed in on that.
I'm dead serious Democrats running for president of the United States. I'm dead serious Democrats running the House of Representatives. If you want to stop Donald Trump, it is time to stop fighting by Marcus of Queensberry rules. It's time to roll up your sleeves and go after him and do whatever it takes to win. If you don't do that, well,
you'll see him again.
Yeah,
4 more years.
You'll have Donald Trump for 4 more years.
I co-sign that. My own 2 cents. Every Democrat running for president should travel to Puerto Rico and quickly and associate himself and herself with this political triumph. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us in Washington, NBC News correspondent Heidi Perez-Bella. With us at the table, Rick Stengel, author of the upcoming book, Information Wars, and former veteran of the Obama administration. Heather McGhee is back. She's a senior fellow at Demos. Plus, chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, Mark Leibovich, is back, and White House reporter for the LA Times, Eli Stokols, is here. Let me start with you, Heather. We have been here for some of the lowest moments of the Trump presidency. I'm thinking some of the real human calamities at the border and whatnot. Yesterday was a setback for Trump, but and we're going to get to this, in this sort of distortion field, they did an end zone dance. I thought the story coming out of Puerto Rico, it was just as unlikely that corrupt governor would be taken down by a process in the State House and by protests on the street. But there is a sort of a kernel of that story that I wonder if Democrats will try to scale nationally.
I think it'd be beautiful if they did. I think the scale of the protest was obviously massive, right? You had about 1 out of every 3 people on the island, and those are the official counts, which we know are always a little unreliable. But at the same time, there was a poll right before the 2018 midterm that showed that, in fact, 1 out of every 4 Americans had protested in some way over the first 2 years of the Trump administration.
That's amazing.
It's happening here as well, just not in this compressed fashion. I'll also say the media climate in Puerto Rico is much, much different. And I think really what has happened with the digestion of the Mueller report and the digestion of the Mueller hearing is really, people could write theses for a long time about media studies and media
What do you
analysis.
mean? I mean, let's go there. What are you talking about?
Well, I just think that we have let the terms of the debate, the terms of victory, be set by not just television optics and not just news optics, but like reality television optics, right? I mean, we let someone who knows more about how to garner attention and to make a good moment, which is a reality TV star marketer, right, which is the man in the White House right now, we let him decide that if there was not going to be an explosive moment, then Mueller was not going to be successful. If it wasn't good TV, it wasn't, an accurate presentation of the lies, the cheating, the corruption, the scandal, and the betrayal of our country, which was all the facts that were laid out. It reminded me of the Kavanaugh hearing, right, where you had Donald Trump saying, and I think everybody feeling after the first day, after Dr. Ford's testimony, this is a credible and damning portrayal of what happened.
Including Donald Trump.
Including Donald Trump, right, saying that. And then Kavanaugh just decided and was coached to basically blow up and chew the scenery, as we say in the theater, right, to just act, basically, perform his outrage, and that turned everything, as if it changed somehow the truth of what we had seen the day before. It's a very sad moment in our democracy that the media is creating these rules and being played by Donald Trump in a lot of ways.
You're an expert in disinformation, Russian disinformation, but we're consuming a lot of it, and I don't know that everyone even knows they are. Your thoughts on, just pick up on where Heather took us.
Well, he is the master of disinformation, Donald Trump. I mean, in the same way that Putin weaponized grievance in Russia and ISIS weaponized grievance in the Middle East among Muslims, he's weaponizing grievance among people who feel disenfranchised. And I have to say, in looking at the protests in Puerto Rico, I remember a mythical time called the 60s, which not everybody here around the table remembers. But, I mean, there were protests, hundreds of thousands of people every day. And in fact, when the Nixon impeachment hearing started, basically there was very little support among the public for it. And in fact, the demonstrations, all that actually increased it. And so I've been surprised and dismayed that there are not more demonstrations. In fact, it reminds me of Tahrir Square in Egypt, where the most populous country in the Middle East, it was overthrown by day after day, hundreds of thousands of people protesting. That has a lot of power to the media and to everybody to see those pictures every day.
I saw you nodding.
No, I completely agree. And actually, that is a tool in the arsenal of the left and the Democratic Party that they have not used. I mean, they have shown on a couple of pretty memorable occasions, one being the Women's March right after Donald Trump's inauguration.
Which, by the way, drove Donald Trump bat bleep crazy.
Yes, and the gun march after Parkland. I mean, they have shown that they can do this. They have the numbers to do this. And look, I think one very powerful march on Washington, I don't know when it is or what the gathering cry would be, could be an extremely powerful thing, as we saw in Puerto Rico. And I think there is an analogy here which people forget, but in 2010, I mean, the single biggest demonstration that the right had during the Obama years was, remember the Glenn Beck thing, like in 2010?
I remember,
in the middle of the summer, it was I think August 28th. I happen to be writing a story on them, so I remember it exactly. But they got, probably close to about 1 million people around the mall. It was a pretty memorable moment, and it was the one cohesive moment that the resistance to Barack Obama had at that moment, and it was a precursor to the midterms, which was a disaster.
Well, I want to push you on this because I think what Joe Scarborough is saying, and he was brilliant this morning, I think the point that he's trying to make, and he knows Donald Trump, is hit him where it hurts. And we're still fighting, last century's battles or in politics, which are dog years, the 2008 sort of political fights that used to be had. We're fighting against someone who cares about the size of their crowds, about being stupid. I mean, only someone that's afraid of being called stupid tweets, "I'm a stable genius," and his friends confirm. There's a lot of not self-awareness, that would be going too far, but there is recognition. I mean, the thing that made him the most upset as a primary candidate candidate was being caught not having any idea what the nuclear triad is. Like, is that something from my DVR? Is that something from my microwave? Is that what, so people that know him, that talk about the soft underbellies, and I know that's gross, sorry guys, say that it's questioning his wealth, questioning the size of his support, and questioning his intelligence. And I think Joe's point is, hit him where you actually get under his skin. A crowd bigger than his does that.
It is amazing. No, it is true. And it's fairly obvious, too. I mean, maybe when the Democrats have one person to sort of gather around, that he or she can focus on Donald Trump and how to do that. Because right now there's a lot of focus on, intramurally. But you're right. I mean, I'm sort of surprised that people haven't, no Democrats, from what I can tell, or not a lot of Democrats, have gone to Ohio, to Lordstown, for instance, and actually highlighted the things that Donald Trump supporters 3 years ago were very excited about him, and him bringing jobs back and sort of highlighting the fact that, the economy is not helping everyone, very much at the heart of his base.
And the other piece, though, of the Puerto Rico story, and this didn't get as much attention earlier in the week, is that there was a problem. I mean, there was an investigation in the legislature, and that investigation found, I think, 5 offenses that would or could be impeachable. So it was the combination of what you're saying, an uprising from the governor's constituents, and a legislative process that tapped into that.
But think how much bigger the United States is than the island of Puerto Rico. I mean, the problem.
But think how much crappier life was for the people.
Well,
right.
I mean, the comparison works to in some ways. But I think if you step back and you look at this, I mean, Nancy Pelosi saying that this has to be about the facts and not the politics. I mean, if this were just about the facts, they would be probably already down the road of impeachment. It's all about the politics. It's all about the fact that in this country, no matter what Donald Trump does, he's got 40% of the country and a Republican majority in the Senate with him. That's the reality that Nancy Pelosi understands. And so we can all debate, and the Democrats are debating right now, what the best way is to go after Donald Trump and to beat him. But there are a lot of people who just believe, look, this is the reality in the Senate, this is the reality in Washington. You talk about a president who values crowds. He measures things in black and white, wins and losses. If you go down the road of impeachment and he's not removed from office, he will count that as a win, and he will paint it as a loss for Democrats going right into the election. And so there are a lot of people who look at this. I mean, I've been out on the campaign trail, too, watching Democratic candidates, and the people who are asking them questions are mostly not asking them questions about impeachment, about Donald Trump and the investigations. They want to talk about other things, pocketbook issues. Maybe that's representative of the whole country. Maybe that's just people who go to Democratic events. I don't know. But there is a debate on this. And, Donald Trump feels pretty secure for now because he doesn't believe he's going to be removed from office as a result of these investigations. He may feel less secure when he looks at 2020, depending on who the matchup is. And I think that's the debate the Democrats are having. Pelosi and a lot of other folks feel like, impeachment is just setting us up. It might be principled. It might be the right thing to do. There might be enough fact pattern to go after that. But at the end of the day, if he's not removed from office, we're just sort of wasting our time. Let's focus on the election.
Heidi, there's a line in The American President when Annette Bening's character screams at her boyfriend, the president, and says, on election day, people care about what I tell them to care about. What happened in Washington that no one thinks they can do anything other than listen to what voters ask questions of the 23 Democrats at poorly attended town hall events? I mean, why are Democrats so convinced that nothing can change?
I think they felt defeated over, going back to the Mueller report, just the way this all kind of rolled out with Barr setting the narrative and having their hands tied, at least they felt like they were, for several weeks, while that narrative really kind of marinated and baked into the entire populace. Now that we have, even after this testimony, only one Democrat now who came out afterwards and said she is for impeachment. So it really didn't move things in terms of the broader public or within her own caucus. That is causing, I think, a lot of morale problems within the Democratic caucus. I know for a fact from speaking with Democrats that they thought that this would be their moment with Mueller weeks before. And as time went on, kind of that entire crescendo went down to just a murmur. And so that, I think, is one big demoralizing aspect for the Democrats. But I don't think that they have given up on trying to draw the public public's attention to the core issues like health care that Democrats want to run on. And on the contrary, they actually have a strategy for this. When you talked about Lordstown, for instance, I reported a couple of months ago that the DNC is actually collecting data on each and every one of these promises that Trump made in very specific communities like Lordstown or like to the Harley-Davidson workers out in Missouri. And when he arrives back in those communities to talk about keeping America great again, the Democrats will be ready to drop that data with whoever their nominee is to be able to use that. The question at hand right now, Nicole, I think for the Democrats, the big political question for them is now that the House clearly is not at least imminently going to move on impeachment, how is the 2020 field going to handle this? Because, yes, while Eli is right, they're not really talking about it that much as they are about other issues. When you drill down into the polling data, a majority of Democrats did and do want impeachment. So what kind of a backlash is there going to be now that they feel like there's a bookend here? Mueller's testified, nothing's happening. What's the fallout going to be on the campaign trail? How are the Democrats going to handle it? We've got a debate next week, maybe a good indication.
So to your point, Heidi, here's how Elizabeth Warren has responded around these questions. I read the Mueller report the day it came out. 3 things were clear. Hostile foreign government attacked our 2016 election. Trump welcomed their help, and Trump obstructed the investigation into that attack. I agree with at NCP, it's time to begin impeachment. Julian Castro, President broke the law. Mueller's testimony today underlined what was already clear. The President of the United States broke the law, would be under criminal indictment if not for the fact that he holds that office. He's not above the law. Congress should begin impeachment proceedings. And then you have, as you're just describing, this divide. We showed Nancy Pelosi. We also have Dan Ball's great reporting that Democrats are now left with one option to end Trump's presidency, the 2020 election. So the case closed, right? I mean, we are done. You think there'll still be a drumbeat of stories about divisions within Pelosi's caucus, or is this case closed?
For now, the case is closed on impeachment. You heard that from the speaker herself last night when she said that they were going to continue with the investigations, and she even outlined these court proceedings that they're now looking to and new avenues of investigative probing. For instance, she said that the Mueller report really didn't dive into the president's financial dealings, although Mueller said on the stand that the president was looking to profit during his campaign. And so I think that they will try to, as their darndest, to push some of these witnesses like Don McGahn to testify, and that they're now betting that he will be a better witness. But they're not going to get their aha moment. They're not. And these numbers have kind of gelled and solidified right now. And Pelosi is not going to move until she's got a number in her caucus that she feels comfortable with. Right now, that number is 95. We know because a couple of Democrats forced a resolution a week or two ago. 95 Democrats voted in support of impeachment proceedings. That's not a majority. And until she gets there, the members are going to be leading her. So,
Heather, this feels like a really, really, really smart strategy. If every one of the 23 Democrats is polling 15 to 20 points ahead of Trump, and Democrats are sure they got this. They're sure, like, we got this. We're going to get him out. Statute of limitations won't have expired. SDNY could still charge him in the campaign finance case where he's, what's it called? Oh, an unindicted co-conspirator. Right. And then if they wanted to, I don't know, the U.S. attorneys out of D.C. could charge him where he's what? Oh, accused of 10 acts of obstruction of justice that would land anybody. And then, I don't know, anything else that the Justice Department turns up but can't indict on. So it's an awesome strategy. Like, yay, if they're 20 points up in every poll, every one of the 23 candidates who could end up being the nominee, right?
Right, but they're not. I mean, and this is why.
So he could win?
So, of course he could win.
Yeah.
Robert Mueller said yesterday, they're still at it today, right? And it seems like every couple of weeks we learn more and more about the Russian disinformation campaigns being more effective than we thought, right? There was a sense of like, this happened, and like some people maybe liked a few things on Facebook. No, it had demonstrable effect at suppressing the vote of who? Exactly the people who worked their tails off.
Right.
The Democratic base, the unlikely voters, and including a lot of independents who have now been way radicalized over into the Democratic Party. Party. It will never be Republican again because of Donald Trump. They surrendered to the Democrats. They delivered to the Democrats an historic 2018 election. They delivered the biggest protest this country has ever seen, not once but twice. The second Women's March in many cities was bigger than the first. And this Democratic Party has done what exactly with their historic caucus in the House, has done what exactly with the historic amount of passion that is being felt in the grassroots? Nothing. And I worry about the impact that Pelosi's tight control, not to mention her war against some of the rising stars in her party, is having on the enthusiasm of the voters who are going to be responsible for making calls, putting out yard signs, donating, moving people, talking to their neighbors. That's what democracy is about. That's what the Democrats need always, and they're really risking it. It's very worrisome to me. And of course Donald Trump could win. Of course he could.
But I thought the whole point of you starting with the Puerto Rican demonstration.
Are you playing magazine editor?
Yeah, well, I'm connecting the dots with it.
Glad someone does.
The audience. Attention, producers. The audience for the demonstrations is not just Donald Trump. The audience is Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic caucus. If Nancy Pelosi saw 1 million people on the mall out every day,
it's a great
point.
Then
that would change your mind. I mean, how many people in the last 2 days have said, including Nancy Pelosi, the Lincoln line, public sentiment is everything? Well, public sentiment is demonstrations of hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the country. That will persuade them.
That's a great point.
I mean, I would get more local here. I mean, I think when Nancy Pelosi says we would proceed with impeachment if we had the facts. I mean, the logical follow-up is you don't feel like you have the facts now. I mean, I honestly don't know what she would say. I mean, she's making a political calculation, but what she really means is we don't have the votes.
To be fair.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.